One of the things we're going to go over today is CO2 is requested by some of the officers in officers meeting to just go over it, what it is. CO2 is carbon. Let's see if we start this up real quick. CO2 is carbon dioxide. Most of the time, people always confuse carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is one carbon molecule and two oxygen molecules. It makes up about 0.04% of the atmosphere and is non-flammable. It is a product of your breathing. It's found all over, especially now. It's used in all sorts of different industrial processes, greenhouses, slaughterhouses, fertilizer manufacturing. They use it in marijuana grow facilities. It's one of the things we're starting to see. They can actually inject it into the atmosphere. It helps the plants grow. Where you're probably going to run into it though is in a restaurant. They use it for providing carbonation to beverages. We're seeing a lot bigger tanks in there, which is why more people are getting sick from it, which drove all the codes that we'll get into. They inject it in the brewing process of beer. So around here, like Roosters has a bunch of CO2 on hand, and the Hive Winery has it. One thing it's really good at it is it displaces oxygen, so it's used as a fire extinguishing agent. It might be in just a mobile fire extinguisher unit or a fixed fire suppression system. It's dangerous because it's a simple asphyxiant. It displaces oxygen, therefore you can't breathe. It is considered a hazardous substance by the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. What that means is if you work around it, your employer is required to inform you of what the dangers of any sort of hazard or chemical within your working area. So in theory, these restaurants are supposed to be providing information to their workers saying, this is what CO2 is, this is what this alarm does, this is what you should do if it goes off. It's not always happening. It obviously hasn't been happening because I've walked in two places that have had active leaks and they didn't know what it was with the alarm going off. Health effects include headaches, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, and asphyxiation. CO2 concentrations around 40,000 parts per million are immediately dangerous to life or health. Calls for service have come in a bunch of different ways, and we have some case studies that we'll kind of get into at the end, showing you how these have been called in, but it may come in as a man down, breathing problem, possible arrest, whatever. CO2 is 1.5 times heavier than air, which makes below-grade installations more dangerous. Because of the way CO2 expands, the concentrations can increase rapidly. So in a basement where there's limited ventilation, it ends up causing high concentrations fast. Exposure potential is, again, because CO2 is all over the place, it could come from a lot of different areas. Occupants of the building may become exposed to dangerous levels of CO2 in several ways. The main one being leaks.
Attention 53. Respond to rescue at 427 South 755 East. Attention 53. Respond to rescue at 427 South 755 East.
The main way is that leaks or discharges somehow. There's a lot of different signs of a leak, but like anything like an audible hissing or discharge from a CO2 cylinder, tank, or piping. A big one is frosting on the outside of the tank or an activated alarm of some type, whether it be a fire alarm or they actually have CO2 monitoring system alarms, one of those. We'll get into all this a little bit later. And then, like it says, depending on the application, fire alarm or audibles, horn strobe. So a really good way to know if you have a CO2 tank that's leaking, this is inside.
Attention 53, 427 South 755 East. 76-year-old female, lip assist, negative interest.
So this is inside of the AMC theaters. This is actually, we found this leaking in Layton. And these large CO2 tanks have kind of come in and replaced the smaller ones that you may have seen. So you can have varying sizes of CO2 tanks or any sort of tank for that matter. But what we've seen is because they get a discount for doing bulk tanks in bulk sizes, and it's just easier for them, they're putting in these larger tanks, which is what you see here. So this tank was actually leaking. What it ended up being is they had on their syrup rack just downline, they ended up having a open connection. It was causing CO2 just to discharge into the atmosphere. What happens is when there's so much CO2 being discharged, it has a hard time regulating temperature, and it ends up causing this frost on the outside of the tank. So you see that frost build up on the outside, and then the supply piping all above it is all frosted over. If you see something like that, especially in a climate controlled area, that's odd. It's not supposed to be that way. One thing that I wanted to point out with these pictures, because it's pretty good examples, you'll see up on the top of the tank, there's that red and white striping. That's actually an emergency shutoff. It's an arrow pointing towards it, and it points up towards a knob up here, this red knob. You just shut that off, and it'll stop the tank from leaking, so long that the leak is coming from downstream of the valve. So again, carbon dioxide removes or displaces oxygen from the atmosphere, and when it creates an oxygen deficiency, it's able to remove a portion of the fire triangle and doesn't support combustion anymore. So it removes oxygen, can't support combustion. Asphyxiation occurs around 7% concentrations of CO2. Most fire suppression systems are designed to flood an area of 34% concentration. So the atmosphere in there is not going to be sustainable for life if you are stuck in there. They have a lot of safety features on these systems, fire suppression systems, like signage, sirens, and odorizers such as mint. So signage, we'll have some pictures at the end, but you're gonna walk in and there's gonna be signs like this building or this room is protected by a CO2 fire suppression system, do not enter if alarm is sounding, say something like that. A siren is a really good indicator. So you'll have your main fire alarm system, that thing's gonna be screaming, and then you'll have this very noticeable, audible, separate alarm, and it's a siren, and that's only activated as it sees or as it feels CO2 running through the piping. And the other one that really stands out is they odorize some of the CO2. I'm not saying they're all gonna be that way, but a lot of the ones I've seen have odorizers on them. So the CO2 tank will discharge, and they downline, they have like a mint capsule, there's like mint, there's bubble gum, and it actually will mix, because you can't detect CO2 normally, so they add some sort of odorizer to it, like mint or like that bubble gum, so that it stands out and you go, oh hey, that's odd. It's because there's CO2 in the atmosphere. So when I was at West Valley, they had this robot that this big manufacturing facility was wanting to protect, and they provided it with mint. So you're in this big manufacturing facility and all of a sudden mint just smacks you in the face. Something's off, right? Like the fire service has always had a culture of like, you know, paying attention to your surroundings, especially if something is odd or not normal, it's probably something's going on, right? So if something's out of place, just take a second look around you and see what's going on. I do have a video here. I'll have to switch screens real quick. So in this video, we'll actually see a CO2 system discharge. What you're gonna see is like a pre-alarm feature. So the alarm will start to sound. What that pre-alarm is it's a delay. So it allows, that alarm goes off, it allows whoever's in that room to get out, and then it'll finally discharge.
Go.
So it's like you saw, alarm activated. It delays the activation of the system, so you have time to get out, and then it just dumps CO2 in there. I'm not 100% sure what the oxygen in that room is, but on average, if you have like a leaking CO2 tank in like a basement, you're like 16%, and that's a sealed room. So this fire suppression system is a sealed room with much larger tanks that is meant to drop the oxygen, so it's low. So kind of the way they work, if you're familiar with like a pre-action system, a building has a main alarm panel, right? CO2 systems, they have another alarm panel called, and all it is just, it activates a panel, it's just a releasing panel. So what'll end up happening is fire happens in the room, that fire detector is going to pick up something, whether it be smoke, heat, and it's going to send a signal back to that panel and say, and start opening relays. So it'll start opening all these relays, these solenoid valves on these tanks, and it allows CO2 to enter the system and it floods the whole room. Identifying CO2 comes in a bunch of different ways. Main one being placarding. So like you said on the left there, carbon dioxide gas can cause injury or death. You'll see signs like that all over. You walk in the 7-Eleven, they have those signs up. That placard right there, the 704 placard, is the actual placard for CO2, with SA being a simple asphyxiant. Another really good way to identify it is just tanks, period. So here you see the large tanks they have stored within these. These are at the triple stops, the one on Gentile and the one on 193. But you can see just varying sizes of tanks. So they have these little tiny guys, and then they have the big monsters in the back. These guys are like 75 pounds, the smaller ones. The silver ones are like 300 pounds of CO2, so a lot. Anything over 100 pounds has to be provided with an alarm, a monitoring system, which is what these little screens are right there with the lights on them. Exterior fill stations is a good way to identify if they have CO2 on hand from the exterior. Not every place is provided with these, but a lot of them are. So this is at the Mavericks. They have actually had people die filling these. So the guy comes up, what the intent is that they can have some CO2 company come out and he can make his rounds at 4 a.m. or whatever. He's running around filling all these up, so he never has to really intrude on the business. But what's happened is these things have leaked. They've had a leak in the hose between the fill station and his truck, and it just kind of smacks you in the face. That's how it's been described to me. Like, you don't realize it's happening to you until it just, all of a sudden, you can't breathe. So they had a guy actually drop, and he actually died in the back of his truck. They're trying to fill one of these. So alarms. So the code says that anything over 100 pounds of CO2 has to be provided with an alarm or ventilation. Typically, it would be super cost prohibitive to provide ventilation because you have to have an engineer design it, and they have to install it. So what most people do is they just put in these monitoring systems right here. The little screen right there has sensors. The sensors are ran to any place that's capable of having a leak. So whether it be inside the tank room, it could be at the syrup rack, it could be wherever. They're mounted about 12 inches above the floor because CO2 is heavier than air. It sits at floor level. They're constantly monitoring the atmosphere, and there's different levels we'll see on a different slide. But once it sees an IDLH atmosphere, which on these are set to 30,000 parts per million, IDLH being 40,000 parts per million, they want you to know about it before it really kicks on. So they have two settings. So if it's just flashing, their instructions are they need to contact their CO2 company to come out and just check it, see why it's leaking somewhere. Flashing plus an audible alarm means you need to evacuate, and then from the outside, call the fire department, have them come out and check it. So they have signage all around, that says when light is flashing, carbon dioxide is detected, so. Yeah, they're all over, so you'll go to like 7-Eleven, you're gonna see it, like, at any restaurant that has a large tank is gonna have them in there. So here's the code requirements, so again, anything over 100 pounds, you have to have ventilation or a gas detection system. The gas detection system is set up in two ways. It activates an audible or visible supervisory alarm at a normally attended location upon detection of a carbon dioxide concentration of 5,000 parts per million. So that's when it's just gonna start flashing. They're instructed, call their CO2 company, come out and look at it and see what's going on. The other setting is it activates an audible and visible alarm within the room or immediate area where the system is installed upon detection of a carbon dioxide concentration of 30,000 parts per million, so just below the ideal H atmosphere. And it, again, because of the nature of CO2, it expands rapidly, so it doesn't take very long to get from 5,000 to 30,000 if you have a leak.
Is that the same kind of code though, that you don't have to make them go up to code every year on that?
No, this
They
is
have to
actually,
get a permit, or?
this isn't like grandfathered or anything. They have to bring it up. So if we see them now, we require them. What we're running into a lot is restaurants will come out, we'll do an inspection, they'll say, yeah, well, I'll just keep 250 pounds on site and I'll be below that 100. That's fine, but then a week later, they get a new CO2 company who comes in and sells them one of these massive tanks down here at the end, which is 300 pounds. So that's what we run into a lot, and there's some places they'll say, okay, well, I'll keep it at 99 pounds, or whatever. They'll kind of figure out a way to get around it. Truly though, these systems really aren't that expensive, and a lot of CO2 companies are leasing them now, and we've heard that some of the providers are going to stop filling them without alarms because they are having their people get sick too. So the way the code's interpreted is that it's the total amount of CO2 that's on site. So if you have, 5 50-pound cylinders, you're over 100 pounds. Another thing that we've run into and encountered is they'll have that 300-pound cylinder at the end and say, well, we only fill it to 99 pounds or 75 pounds. Again, the code says if it's capable of storing over 100 pounds, you have to provide an alarm. Because they have no way of knowing how much is in there really. Like, they can't sit there and prove it to me that they have 75 pounds on board. They're capable of storing 300. So we require, if it's over 100 pounds, you have to have an alarm or ventilation, up to them. Ventilation does not mean they could put it outside, because again, the code says anywhere a leak can happen. So just because you put your tank outside, the piping is run through the building, it's capable of leaking inside the building, and there's some case studies at the end where that actually happened. So just a couple things to consider for you all. CO2 poisoning is always a possibility. The call may come in whatever way, but if there's CO2 on hand, if it looks like that, if there's something that's saying there is, maybe it is CO2. It's just something to consider. You definitely should be training on CO2 storage. So when you're out and about doing your inspections, pre-plans, whatever, if you're seeing placards, like any placard for that matter, any sort of hazardous material, it's something to know, keep in the back of your head. Train on recognizing signs of a leak. So again, alarms, frosting of the tanks, all those are signs that something's going wrong. And then just maintaining your situational awareness as always. Again, if something seems off, it probably is. One of the things that I wanted to hit on was if in the event that we have a restaurant fire or whatever and these CO2 tanks or the piping has been compromised by a fire, shutting it off is necessary for sure, because you're going to have guys that work in there on overhaul, investigators, whatever, and if you have this thing slowly leaking, you might cause somebody to get sick down the road. So just make it a habit. If you see it in there, shut it off. So it seemed around 2011 there was a lot of people getting sick from this and dying, and that makes sense because they changed the code shortly after this. So in Phoenix, which they made it pretty public about what had happened to them, firefighters were dispatched to a McDonald's for an employee who had a fall injury. That's exactly how the call came in, as a fall. The employee stated she was checking on something in the basement when she became lightheaded and fell. Another employee heard the fall and went into the basement to help. They both started feeling something was off, and they were able to make it up the stairs. They called 911 and firefighters arrived shortly after. How I read it is the captain stayed with the patient, and the engineer and one of the firefighters went down to the basement to figure out what was going on. They got downstairs, they started feeling lightheaded. They came up out of the basement, and the engineer ended up collapsing, and they were both complaining of dizziness and a bitter taste in their mouth. The captain, not knowing what's going on, calls for a HazMat response. The manager's like, oh hey, we just had our CO2 systems filled earlier in the day. They went down and they metered the basement, found the lowest readings of O2 was 17.5%. They ended up finding a broken line on the tank. The HazMat team spent about 30 minutes ventilating the basement. On the final re-entry of the HazMat team, they found 0 readings on 2 CGI meters and 2 gas range meters. 3 injuries, no deaths. So Phoenix had a close call with it, and they made it pretty apparent. There's some videos out there if you ever want to watch them. In Pooler, Georgia, September 2011, around the same time as the other one, the fire department was dispatched to a call for 2 unconscious women found in a restroom. A total of 10 people were transported to the hospital that day, including 3 firefighters. One of the women was found unconscious, passed away from her injuries. So they do the autopsy, they found this woman had been asphyxiated, and they're like, oh, we should do an investigation. So they go back and they find that a leaking CO2 line between the walls allowed CO2 to leak into the bathroom, and it killed a woman. So again, that's why they say anywhere a leak can happen. This one was pretty recent. 4 contractors were working inside an electrical room that was protected by a CO2 fire suppression system. Somehow the system was discharged, and 3 of the workers were able to escape the room, but 1 unfortunately was not. He was incapacitated by the carbon dioxide. Firefighters made entry. They were able to rescue the worker from the room and found him not be breathing, have no pulse. Upon arrival at the hospital, they actually got him back, and his pulse and breathing had been restored. He ended up being put in a medically induced coma, where he ended up dying a few weeks later from his injuries. So that was from a suppression system activating inside this room, and he couldn't escape. So that's the end of this one. Really, the things I just wanted to take away is just think about it. CO2 is a hazardous material, truly it is, but it's so frequent around us that we're not recognizing it. But the tanks are getting bigger, and I honestly think that there's probably been more exposures by fire departments out there. Like, Layton had one, so I imagine if you look at places like New York or LA where the population is just much larger, they probably encountered this, but it just hasn't been brought up. So it's all over, so think about it, train on it. The HazMat team does have CO2 monitoring now, so it is an option if you ever feel it's needed. Is there any questions? Yeah.
You said with one of the codes says it requires needs to have the sensor if it could potentially leak. Is there for larger buildings, what's the spacing on those? Is it sensor every 75 to 100 feet?
Well, so it just depends on the application. So when I was doing some research on this, I ended up going to this marijuana grow facility in Bountiful, which was awesome, by the way. And they had sensors throughout the whole building because it's at a constant level of CO2, but the pipings ran all over. So realistically, there's a lot more, right? They have sensors everywhere because they have to. In a restaurant, these sensors are only going to be where a leak can happen. You're not going to get a leak in the furthest corner of the building where there's nothing around it. So most of the time it's at where the tank is stored and at the syrup rack. That's where it's at. And they're super easy. These things just run off. They can just plug these into the wall and they can run as many sensors as they want. They're not a big deal at all. So they're super sensitive. I saw one guy test it, and he literally just put it in his hands and breathed into it, and it went off. So, any other questions? Okay. Well, like I said, if you guys ever run into these or you see them on inspections, you need need some help, or you think they're over and they need an alarm, whatever, just give us a call and we'll go out and get them installed. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Brady's gonna say.